Hi, I'm your State Representative Annette Glenn. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Hometown Heroes. Each episode of Hometown Heroes will feature community leaders, local nonprofits, and others who make a significant positive impact in the 98th District. The place we call home has so much to be proud of. I hope you enjoy learning from our hometown heroes. As always, if you ever have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to contact my office. Enjoy the show.
Hello, I'm John Perry, and this is Hometown Heroes with Representative Annette Glenn. And Representative Glenn, it's nice to see you. Who is your hometown hero with us today?
John, I am excited to introduce you to Dick Dolinsky.
Dick.
He is founder of the Legacy Center and Midland Kids First, and has just done some amazing work in Midland, so we're going to chat about that today.
Wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate the introduction.
Thanks for being here, Dick.
It's good to be here.
Well, let's just jump right in and talk about the model for youth success.
Well, it turns out that we're always interested in what factors drive kids' performance in school, both positively and negatively. And one of the more interesting things that happens in the world is there's an organization called the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA for short, just like the Leaning Tower, but not exactly. And they assess children around the world in three broad categories: mathematics, science, and literacy. And the United States is always historically somewhere near the bottom of the list when you look at their outcomes. And people are concerned about it. And so we often get the question asked, what's wrong with our schools? So we went ahead and investigated that. We're primarily a research organization. We think of ourselves as a think and do tank. So we do the research, but we also then try to implement programs afterwards.
Absolutely.
So we came up with a model for youth success. We got about 150 people together that in some way or another deal with children. So they are physicians and educators and social scientists and so forth. And they came up after about a year and a half of some very good discussions, facilitated and otherwise. The old joke about there was mud, blood, and beer on the floor after we were done. But when we were done, we came up with this model for youth success. And there are four broad dimensions that this team indicated are very important and crucial for a youth to be successful, both from a learning and from a development standpoint. And those four dimensions are basic needs and safety. So every child needs to have food, shelter, clothing, not be subject to bullying or physical assault and the like. Physical health, and this is everything from prenatal care to well baby visits and well child visits, vaccinations, dental care, exercise, proper nutrition, and the like. The third one is something we call well-being today. It originated as social, emotional, and spiritual health, but that was a mouthful, so we contracted that to well-being. And then the fourth one is quality education. So the premise here is that if all four of those elements are in place, then the child will be successful both from a learning and a development standpoint.
All right, so you get together, you look at the data, then what's next?
Well, what we ended up doing is saying, okay, this is a wonderful concept, it's a great strategic model, how do we implement this thing? And so the report actually from this committee is probably about 1.5 inches thick in a binder. It has a good deal of detail associated with each of those four elements. And one of the concepts that came up out of this study was the idea of what we call a community school program. It's actually mirrored after the Department of Health and Human Services Pathways to Potential program, the P2P as they refer to it. And that program is originated in an attempt to improve student attendance, to reduce truancy issues at schools. So our iteration of it, our expansion of it, is to include the ability of the program to not only deal with truancy issues, but deal with two other issues that affect student outcomes. One is behavioral health issues. So some students have attention deficit disorder, they may be depressed, they may have hyperactivity disorders and the like. So there's a behavioral element to it. And the other one is just plain school performance, if their grades are bad. So in addition to truancy, we added those other two dimensions. The next step in the process involved partnering with the Department of Health and Human Services a so-called youth success coach from the department was embedded in our school that had the highest poverty level. 68% of the children in this particular school were eligible for free or reduced lunch, which is the proxy we used for determining the poverty level. Yeah. And quite predictably, their scores on the standardized test instruments, the MSTEP, Michigan Student Testing and Evaluation Program, were the lowest in our county. So this youth success coach, simply, and that's overstating what he does, he works very closely with the staff at the school, the principals and the teachers, who then identify children who have one or more of those three issues: behavioral issues, great performance, or truancy. And then he meets with the child, and if and as necessary with their parents, with their family, with the child's family, to make determinations of just what the problems are. And invariably, they fall into one or more of those three categories, the first three: basic needs and safety, physical health, social, emotional, spiritual health, or well-being, as we call it. They are obviously in school, so the school component is being delivered at the same time. What he does then, when he identifies what these deficits are for the child, then he tries to match up or bring the child together and the child's family, as necessary, with existing community resources. So it's kind of a wraparound services program. And so invariably, we have aligned in our county, and we are just really blessed to have so many nonprofit organizations that provide a variety of services that fit very nicely into those three categories. So let me share some examples with you, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So for example, if the student is chronically truant because there's a transportation issue, the car doesn't work, the car is broken. And by the way, I did say that this school is the poorest school in the county. Yes. So if the car is broken, I don't get to school. And so time on task matters from academic performance as well. So the child's academic performance is suffering, the child is chronically truant. So it turns out there is a church in town that has a large congregation, and that congregation has agreed to and has constructed a 4-stall garage in its parking lot. And its congregants, who are trained automotive technicians, volunteer their time, and they will repair cars at no cost for people who are economically disadvantaged. They're a licensed car repair facility, so they are able to secure auto parts at wholesale costs from the usual, car parts stores that seem to be ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And then they don't mark them up. They pass on the cost directly to the consumer. And then conversely, anybody who is not economically disadvantaged can have their cars repaired at that facility at commercial rates. And so they still use the volunteer labor, if you will. So they can add money to their operation so they can underwrite some of their overhead costs associated with it. It's a marvelous program.
It's a marvelous program.
So just as an illustration on the outcomes there, it turns out that once this program has started, truancy in that school has now equaled the average of the schools in the county. It's at the same average, and they've actually had, the 3 years that we've been doing this program, they've had 2 days of 100% attendance. Now that's pretty hard to do, and that's kind of a fluke, we all admit. But it wasn't on, there were no incentives, there were no count days, where people try to incentivize kids so they count for the foundation allowance. No, these are just standard days. So a little bit fluky, but nevertheless, point is, attendance has risen to those levels. So if the child has a food insecurity problem, there's a soup kitchen, there are food pantries, there's a so-called Backpack Buddies program where children can take food home for the weekend when they're not in school and not fed the free lunches, for example, and so on. If they have clothing requirements, Midland, believe it or not, for you people living in the tropical Lansing area, it can get very cold in the wintertime, and we have lots of snow, just like when I was in school, to walk to school 2 miles in the snow, uphill both ways.
With 2 broke legs.
Not quite. But so if the child, for example, in no laughing matter, doesn't have a proper coat to wear or doesn't have boots in the snow and so on, there's a clothes closet in town. They provide that. One of the problems has been dental care. Kids with bad teeth. Doesn't matter who the teacher is, or kids suffering from pain from a tooth problem. It's not going to be very conducive to learning. So the dentists in town, we have a program called Adopt a Child's Smile. And
Yes.
it's kind of put together by and run by Rotary, but there's a fund that's been established. Dentists volunteer their time to repair the teeth, and they want to be reimbursed for their consumables, their out-of-pocket expenses for injectables, fillings, and the like. And so that program is working very well from a repairing teeth standpoint. So going back to the school then, so all of those needs as they're identified that fit the model for youth success, those three components, when a need's identified, the youth success coach connects with existing resources. They're brought to bear to repair or ameliorate the problem. And so what's the upshot? After 3 years, that school's performance on the standardized test has gone up 35%. So it's very significant. And as I indicated, the attendance, the truancy has dropped to attendance is at the average of the district. So it's been an incredibly successful program. It's a very robust model to deal with issues that interfere and impede. There's significant barriers to learning. So you need to close those gaps that have to do with those three components. And then the fourth component is pretty important too, and that's the issue of education. So going back to that PISA study, so it turns out that the United States has the second highest child poverty rate of the developed nations in the world. It's a real shame. We're a very wealthy country. We have so many resources, and yet there are so many children who still are mired in poverty. And if you do any studies, you'll find that poverty correlates with all sorts of social issues, and education is one of them, leading the list. So it turns out that the United States scores are in fact pretty near the bottom of the PISA list of nations. But if you take the schools in the United States that have low poverty, they outperform all the other nations in the world. The number one nation in terms of the PISA study, when corrected for poverty, if you will, if we put up our children from school districts that have low poverty rates, they win. They're number one in the world in all three categories, math, science, and literacy. Historically, Finland and the Scandinavian countries have been near the top. Finland, I happen to know, has a 3% child poverty rate. The United States is in the the low 20s of percent. It's 22, 23%. And only Greece, of the developed nations, we're not talking the developing nations of the world, we're only talking Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Canada, US, those kind of countries. Of those countries, only Greece has a higher child poverty rate, a couple, 3 percentage points lower or higher poverty rate than the United States. So it is a scourge, it is a problem, and all of those deficits and needs we spoke to from the model for youth success typically stem from poverty. So the car doesn't work because the family doesn't have the resources to repair the car. They're hungry because they don't have the resources to secure the food. The teeth are bad because they don't have the resources to seek dental care. So we believe that we have found a model that is very useful and very successful in dealing with the issues. The key here in Lansing is what policies are we going to enact? We have in our community, as I said, blessed with these resources, but there are many communities that don't have access to those resources in that community. So we have to do something.
Dick, I'm excited. You came up and we had a roundtable this morning with a number of other legislators that sit over these committees that make these kind of decisions to kind of talk about it. But when I invited them, I said Midland has been able to drop their delinquency and truancy rate 85% because there's been this collaboration going on. Now the program that you're talking about in the school, I happened to run into it in March, so early on serving, was one of the schools that invited me to come read for March's Reading Month. And the principal was so excited to share the success and what's happened over the last 3 years. So I got to meet the DHHS worker and he got to share his success. Good. And then I got to go read in a few classrooms.
So we have extended that program from that one school.
Yes.
We now have 4 schools in the county. That's right, 1, 2, 3, 4 more. So we have 5 total schools in the county that are involved with this program, and we have 3 youth coaches now. One covers the same school we're talking about. One has 2 schools and the other one has 2 schools. So they're smaller schools.
And they love their jobs.
Yeah, they do, and you can understand why they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, the reduction in delinquency, reductions in teen pregnancies, roughly 63% down in teen pregnancies, which is another big plus. Reductions in drug use, all of those are very, very spectacular outcomes that we're very proud of. And it took what Representative Glenn said here, lots of collaboration. It's a wonderful culture that we have, and I'm not sure how it got built, but it's there. We sit around a table once a month, and there's an awful lot of sharing, collaborating that goes on. I think we've learned how to bust down most of the turf battles and silo battles. It's not that it's not there, there's still vestiges of it, but in general, people collaborate and work together, understanding that there's only one objective, to make it better for the kids.
It's been very successful.
Yeah, very.
All right. I know we also want to talk about early childhood development.
Well, that's another hot button.
That's another hot button for you.
Yeah, I get excited about that too. I have to put this in context. Most people say, well, why are you worried about what happens between 0 and 5 before they start school? Well, there's an enormous amount of research done at most of the major American universities on brain development, and brain development especially of children. And we always say kids learn like a sponge. And they learn like a sponge because their brain is developing neural networks, the hardwiring of the brain for all cognitive learning. And so that happens at an incredibly sharp pace, and that's why kids learn like sponges, as we say. They are growing their brains and developing them at a rapid rate, such that most estimates indicate that approximately 85% of whatever cognitive ability a person has is hardwired and in place by between 5 and 6 years of life. It varies a bit by individual. So you're essentially hardwiring the brain through those first 5 and 6 years, and it will determine the bulk of the capacity that that person's brain's going to have going forward for the rest of their lives. So it's really important. So how do you build these neural networks? Well, the mechanism's well known. The body is born, the child is born with almost 1 trillion individual brain cells. Basically, gazillions of them, big numbers. They're kind of like links in a chain, okay? And every time there's a cognitive stimulation of one kind or another, the links join together, but unlike chain links of a fence, not this way, but this way, on end. It forms a synapse, a connection. And it goes in 3 dimensions. It's this way and that way and this way. And some of these scans of kids' brains that I've seen are spectacular. You see kids who have been cognitively stimulated, and there's mostly nothing there. I mean, there's brain matter, obviously, but it's not connected. And then if you see these well-developed brains, it's just a tangle or gnarl of wires going every which way. And it's basically the hardwiring of the brain for all cognitive learning. And it's facilitated by cognitive stimulation. So reading stories, counting, doing things like that are the most important things. So again, it tends to follow poverty. Families that are challenged economically typically don't have the resources to help with developing those neural networks, and vice versa for families that are advantaged economically. So things like books and puzzles and even exercises around the house. So I always tell people, young moms, when you're taking clothes out of the dryer, have them match socks, identify colors of clothing in there, and so forth. We encourage them to play games in the car, for example. If you are stopped at a stop sign, point out the color, it's red. Count the sides, there are 8. Point out the 4 letters, S, T, O, and P, and teach them 4 letters of the alphabet. When they're old enough to understand that these 4 letters make up a word, stop. And you can teach a safety lesson.
Their environment, the signs they see.
Yeah. And they yield signs, they're triangles, they're yellow. There's 5 new letters, Y-I-E-L-D, So
it's endless. If you put a child in an environment and you just engage, anything in that room is an educational experience.
Absolutely. To play I Spy games, start with something starts with the letter T and have them guess if it's a truck or a tree or whatever it is, and then you can do things like start with colors. I spy something green. Is it the grass? Is it something going by, a sign, or what? So it's really important to cognitively stimulate. And one of the developments from the Legacy Center is something we call tool totes. And we worked in partner with the WIC organization, Women, Infants, and Children, This is the nutrition-driven program, but children who are economically disadvantaged, their families, they're eligible, and they begin at birth with the WIC program. So the idea here is that beginning at birth, we can provide each family with a tool tote, as we call them, an infant tool tote, that has learning supplies, believe it or not, for infants. And it has, the first one has a tummy time mat. And so they spend time on their tummies, and there's objects to reach for and colors and soft objects and raspy objects and so forth, coarse objects. So this program replaces it every 6 months, which is the interval when the parent is required to come back to WIC to have the child weighed and measured and to revalidate their income that they qualify for the program. So every 6 months, the first two are called infant tool totes at 0 or birth and 6 months. At 1, 1.5, 2, and 2.5 years old, they are toddler tool totes. And at 3, 3.5, 4, and 4.5, they are preschool tool totes. And they include learning supplies with very simple and easy to use instructions for the use of those. And they are age appropriate. So as the child is older, there are complex puzzles and books to read, and scissors and materials for cutting out and pasting and making collages and so on. So they stimulate their creative abilities as well as their cognitive abilities. So we have done this, and we've assessed the children when they enter kindergarten, and we find that we have a very simple assessment instrument. It's an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper.
Right, the size.
It has the 26 letters of the alphabet in random order. It has the numbers to 25, I think it is, in random order. It has 5 basic shapes: a circle, a triangle, square, oval, and so forth. And then it has the 6 colors, major colors of the rainbow. Remember the Roy G. Biv? I don't think we have a V. We got Roy G. B.I. So anyway, and then the clinician at WIC asks the child to identify the letters. What's this one? What's this one? And when the child misses the letter, it's circled. And then we take it back, and we're the numbers crunchers, and so we do the analysis on it. And it turns out at age 5, when they're entering kindergarten, the children in that program significantly outperform their economically disadvantaged peers who did not participate in the program, and they are at parity with their advantaged peers who did not participate in the program. In fact, even though the differences are minor, they are actually statistically ahead of their advantaged peers. So, like the kids in the program will identify maybe 18.5 letters of the alphabet on average, and their advantaged peers that didn't go through the program identify 18.3 or something like that. So it's slightly higher, but it's a real difference because we have thousands and thousands of data points.
So when did you start the totes?
Oh, quite a while ago. I don't remember what year it was, but like maybe 05, 6, 7, somewhere in there.
So you've been following it almost 15 years.
It's been a while. And then we've also checked their reading scores through the 3rd grade. So there's something called DIBBLES, which is Dynamic Indicator of Early Basic Literacy Skills. And the schools run those tests. And once again, the kids through the program are at parity with their advantaged peers, and the ones who didn't go through the program are below. And that difference persists through the 3rd grade, and at the 3rd grade they've qualified for the M-STEP, and they're literate, they do well. So we're very pleased that that's a very simple and economically, advantaged way of doing it. It's, maybe $40 to $50 a bag, so it's not, and there's probably ways to make it simpler and cheaper as well.
That's impressive. I don't think I knew about the totes.
Learn something new.
I lose every time I'm with you. I learn something new. So how in the world did a chemist from Dow end up in the middle of all of this?
Well, a couple of vectors in my life. I lived in Asia for a number of years for my employer, and I was very interested in my children's education, hung around schools and got interested in schools, and they asked me to serve on their little board, so I did that. And then when we repatriated back to the U.S., I was equally concerned about the repatriation, so I hung around schools through a parent-teacher organization. A vacancy occurred on the local school board. The parents there encouraged me to run. As one of them put it, you kiss the babies, we'll lick the stamps. And in those days, this was 1979, dinosaurs were just becoming extinct.
And we still licked stamps.
We still licked stamps, right. So I was fortunate enough to win, and I ended up serving 18 years on that board. So the science part of me was interested in the data piece, how does this all quantitatively develop, and what correlations can we make? And the education piece came because of hanging around schools for that long. The impetus for the Legacy Center was, as a scientist, you're trained to try to discern patterns or order out of randomness or perhaps even chaos. And I was always just plain concerned about why do some kids make it and some don't. And if you talk to teachers, they can often tell you pretty early on that this kid's a problem and this one's going to be a rocket scientist or whatever. So the premise that keeps popping up is that the kid's environment matters significantly.
Great.
And so if the child does have the preschool experience, if the supports that the model for youth success indicate are in place, which families typically can and do provide, that child has a pretty good shot at being successful. But if the supports are absent and the early childhood development piece has not been paid attention to, then the child's going to struggle. And so basis of the Legacy Center was to do research on those environmental factors, develop programs and implement them, but implement them through collaborating partners. We seldom see a child ourselves. And secondly, I tell people I'm a self-professed recovering data geek, but I am recovering. I'm on step 6. But we are pretty ruthless about evaluating the outcomes of the program, not how many kids we touch, but as I indicated with the tool totes, what performance improvements occurred, what behavioral traits were improved. So, yeah, so that's what we did, and that's how I got from being a chemist to doing these programs.
So if somebody watching this show wanted to help and get involved, what would they do?
Well, I welcome a phone call or a text message or an email contact. I'm not sure if I can leave those
Absolutely.
here.
You can. We'll just put them up
Absolutely.
on the screen, too.
Yeah, so my phone, my cell phone, which is probably the best way to call or text, is 989-859-2290. And you can look us up at the Legacy Center. The web address is tlc4cs.org. That's TLC for the Legacy Center, the numeral 4, CS for community success.org. And my name is it's actually Richard. And so the email address is rdolinski, DOLINSKI, at tlc4cs.org.
Wonderful. Well, Dick, thanks for all that you do in our community.
Thank you.
We're blessed to have you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased and blessed and happy and delighted that you invited me here. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
And thank you both very much, and thank you for joining us.